Hello, viewers and listeners. Welcome back to another episode of the Free Marketeers, the official podcast of the Free Market Foundation. Today, we are joined by a very special guest, Gideon Joubert, the founder and editor of Paratus. You can find Paratus on Facebook at paratus.info. He joins me alongside our head of legal policy and research, Martin van Staden. And today we're going to broach a very sensitive, a very controversial, but a very important topic, and that is the topic of gun rights in South Africa. I think this is an especially important time to visit lots of civil liberties that have been encroached during this time. I think this is one of those times where people have just become much more aware of just how important it is, not only to hold government to account, but to be able to defend yourselves against government encroachment on civil liberties. But we will first run through a bit of the history regarding gun rights in South Africa, specifically the battle that Gun Owners South Africa, GOSA, of which Gideon is on the board of, have taken to government. Gideon, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Jacques and Martin, for inviting me. It's really cool being here and, to be having this discussion with you guys. I think it's a very important one and hopefully entertaining and enlightening as well at the same time.
Yeah, I'm sure it will be. So, Martin, how are you doing?
Yeah, no, I'm doing very well. Every time beforehand that we've discussed gun rights on this channel, it's done very well. So one of those issues where South Africans are not divided along racial lines. It's one of those few things that we can actually come together on. So I'm very excited to get into the meat of it.
Good. Gideon, so back to you. Can you just give the viewers and listeners just a little bit of an oversight of the legal battle that has taken place? I'm starting all the way back 2017 when the SA Hunters Association took government to court and sadly lost that court battle, and also the subsequent interdict that Gun Owners South Africa GOSA got against the SAPD.
That's a heck of a good story, and I might get some of it slightly wrong. So if people end up correcting us post-production, that's also fine because it's been a while. But essentially, as I recall, SA Hunters took the South African police, the Minister of Police, to court with a constitutional argument against the concept of renewing firearm licenses, because the SAPs created a crisis. They essentially sabotaged their own computer systems in 2016, their own IT system, unlawfully sabotaged it. And prior to 2016, if you had a lapsed firearm license, you could still renew it late. After 2016, you could not, because an internal directive was issued. I think it was Brigadier Pashlane or someone similar issued an internal directive that told them to deactivate the parts of the system that allowed that to happen unlawfully. Then they created a crisis where at the time 300,000 to 400,000 people within the next year or two found themselves with expired firearm licenses. By now that number has possibly increased. Some estimates reckon it's as high as 1 million, but I'm not 100% sure on that, and I'm not going to give you inaccurate figures. But it's a big problem. Now, cops didn't want to solve it. And in an attempt to find a solution, SA Hunters took the Minister of Police to court. They attacked it from, amongst others, a constitutional angle, which was then not a victory, unfortunately. There were some really good points in the case, but ultimately the court decided that, it's relicensing guns is not unconstitutional. Relicensing or renewing firearm licenses is not a thing that they deemed unconstitutional. Then in 2018, I think it was about June or July 2018, Gun Owners SA won a court victory in the North Gauteng High Court under Judge Bill Prinsloo. It was quite an extensive judgment that formed part of the interdict the long and short of it, if you had a firearm with a expired license, the police couldn't criminalize you. They couldn't charge you for being in unlawful possession. They couldn't confiscate your firearm. They could not coerce you to surrendering it to them. You could keep your property. And that's been the status quo for almost 2 years now. On the 22nd of this month, next Friday, the appeal would be heard. Now, this, to get from where we were to where we are now, Judge Bill Prinsloo essentially told the police, listen, I'm granting this interdict, fix your systems. In essence, the GOSA legal team demanded that the police obey the law as written, something that they haven't done in totality since the Farms Control Act became law in 2004. So the judge told them, go back to the drawing board, apply the law, follow the law, just obey it. Instead of doing that, they decided to waste more taxpayer money by litigating against the interdict, which Martin, I'm sure, could, and you are quite legally knowledgeable and qualified yourself, Jacques. You guys would know that this is not really the ordinary thing to do. You don't just appeal an interdict. So instead of going back and saying, let's solve the problem, let's listen to what the court has ruled, they just said, no, we're going to appeal against this interdict. They were late on 2 separate occasions in getting their documents into the Supreme Court of Appeal. They've now had to apply for condemnation for their case to even be heard. And the condemnation hearing is essentially happening next week. So this is where we are. The interdict still stands. The police have indicated they are not interested at all in obeying what's been ordered and fixing the problem. They would rather appeal it, which, I don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist, but I think it's quite clear that there's a very clear doctrine from Latulias, from the ANC, of following a sort of civilian disarmament agenda, because that's the only thing that I can rationalize as a reason for following this rather bizarre sort of path that's brought us to where we are today.
Yeah, that's quite a story, actually. It's a very long story. I'd urge people listening to actually go and read up on the details, maybe go and read the judgments themselves. Martin, any thoughts from your side from a rule of law perspective?
Yeah, I think it's indicative of a broader global phenomenon. If you are a history buff like me, someone who enjoys reading history, you'll find that about 100 years ago, it was no taboo to have a firearm. But today, all around the world, especially in the Western world, it's some kind of grave sin. So we see in Canada, they've now banned rifles, I believe, automatic rifles. A similar thing happened in New Zealand. And I mean, it's quite obvious that the South African government has also been very keen on this. And as I've pointed out, and others on this podcast, I think Jacques Blamini made this very poignant point, is that the same revolutionary movement that eagerly used firearms to overthrow an oppressive regime, and rightfully so, is now at the forefront of trying to get rid of citizens' rights to have firearms. But just to be clear, it's not exclusively the governing party. This is a broader narrative. And I must say, at least in South Africa, it's a narrative of the elite almost exclusively. From my experience, having done some radio shows and so on, hearing people, ordinary South Africans, call in and discuss it across the racial line. I must emphasize that this is not a stereotypical white gun owners versus black anti-gun activists issue. Ordinary South Africans are in favor of firearm rights in this country. And my impression is that it is overwhelmingly in favor of firearm rights in this country. So there is a very clear disconnect between what the government is doing and what its electorate has given it a mandate to do. I don't think the government has any mandate whatsoever to engage in disarmament. And the rule of law is very, as a political doctrine, is very concerned with legitimate mandates. And I think South Africans would do very well to push back against this.
Yeah, that. All of those very, very important, pertinent points. And I mean, I think this links to the broader problem of minority yet vocal voices on the fringe, for instance, gun-free South Africa, who have this very condescending view of South Africans in that we live in a country with extreme levels of gun violence, and gun-free South Africa themselves have said they can understand why people are itching to be able to defend themselves, yet then they argue in their name that they want a gun-free South Africa, where basically people will effectively be forced to rely on the security forces to protect them, and those forces themselves are unfortunately not very reliable. And I mean, something I've always said is when people ask you, what do you rather want, a gun in the hand or a policeman on the phone? Well, you want both. You want to be able to phone the police with a gun in your hand, knowing you will be able to defend yourself and your family against any intruders. And I think this just links to a broader point as well. And the next part of this conversation, the next topic that we need to broach is that of gun control. Gideon, I know this is a very sensitive topic and you might get some flack for your views, but what are your views, just broadly speaking, on the issue of gun control itself, especially in South Africa?
Well, ultimately, gun control doesn't work. So it just doesn't. It's a bit like from Firefly, where the guy said you can't stop the signal, and in all honesty, you can't. So gun control is a weird sort of, it's almost like a form of political security theater, where as opposed to putting people with little metal detecting wands at the doors of shopping centers and metal detectors for people to walk through, and we try to convince the public that by having these very visible measures in place that this will somehow enhance their safety by discouraging armed robbers or serious criminals. It's the same concept as that, but from a legislative and political point of view. So once we have explained to people that gun control doesn't work, then you can start branching off into conversations of, should we have it, should it not? And unfortunately, people do cling to it that there needs to be some sort of vetting system. You can have a vetting system that works quite well. Contrary to popular belief, United States isn't a country without gun control. They have extensive gun control in the United States. In essence, we have a heck of a lot in common with their system of gun control. The major difference is where theirs is quite efficient administratively, and they come to the exact same result or conclusion as ours does, and theirs is online, their database is more secure. The way they administer it is just more professional, better, and more effective. For some reason, South Africans, when it comes to gun control, we applaud inefficiency in the sense of, it's a good thing that it should take you 3 to 6 months to gain a firearm license, because for some bizarre reason, waiting 3 to 6 months, an arbitrary amount of time, it's only in existence because that's how inefficient the system is. That's now gives you time to think about it. And I'm like, well, there are far more important life decisions people make in a much shorter period of time as to whether or not they want to own a tool that the only thing that makes it slightly controversial, it has the capacity to project somewhat lethal force. This is the idiotic nature of the argument. So what would gun control look like ideally? I'd say if you are a responsible, law-abiding citizen that doesn't have a criminal record, that hasn't proven to society that you are a criminal, that you have bad intent, then you should pretty much be allowed to own whatever you want in whichever quantities you wish or can afford. Ultimately, finances are going to be a far larger constraint to what guns you buy than the law anyway. So that's the reality. Of course, a whole bunch of people are probably going to differ with me on that.
Yeah, very good points there. And I mean, it's just this broader tendency in society that, people who brand themselves as anti-gun and they want a gun-free society, they only want citizens to be gun free. They do not. They are quite hypocritical in the application of their own quote unquote principles, in that they want the state to be very, very powerful in that sense, in respect of guns and gun ownership and being armed, whereas they want to completely or near completely disarm the citizenry, because how dare people actually trust the citizenry more with firepower than what they trust the states. And I mean, I think the most shocking thing for me with this issue is the proposed amendment to remove self-defense as a legitimate reason to be able to own a gun. I mean, that is just completely asinine. I do not see how you can be a reasonable, relatively intellectual person and think that that is okay, that people should not be able to defend themselves, that they should be forced to rely on a police force, on a security wing of the state that is quite corrupt. And I'm not saying all policemen are corrupt. There are those that do excellent jobs, very excellent jobs, and literally put their life on the line. But to force people to be dependent on them simply because you do not trust those people, I think is absolutely asinine. And Martin, can you just give us a little bit of oversight, the constitutional problems and problems with, from the perspective of a rule of law perspective, with respect to removing self-defense as a legitimate reason to own a firearm?
Yeah, sure. So I think frequent listeners will know I'm a bit of a constitutional revolutionary. So whatever I say now is something that the courts probably will look askance at and be like, what am I talking about? But I firmly believe that this is the correct position. And that is that even though the Constitution does not have a standalone right to a firearm or a right to self-defense, so to speak, I think that if the Constitution is read as a whole, as it should be, according to the Constitutional Court, you cannot read specific parts of it in isolation, then you can certainly say that there is an implied right to defend yourself. If you look at Section 12 of the Constitution, the right to freedom and safety and security. We have the right to be free from all forms of violence, private and public. And that certainly does not imply that we should be protected. It's not necessarily a positive right, but it's very clearly a negative right as well. We should be allowed to protect ourselves. And of course, Section 1 of the Constitution, the most important yet most ignored provision of the Constitution, does say that the advancement of human rights and freedoms shall be an underlying value of the entire constitutional order. Those are just two examples of looking at the Constitution that you can find a very real implied right, and implied rights are a constitutional phenomenon. For instance, the right to know how a political party is funded in South Africa. The Constitutional Court has recognized that right, yet it's not stated explicitly anywhere in the Constitution. So I think it's there, and I think that this ludicrous proposed amendment, I don't think it's been proposed yet, but it's definitely on the cards, and it's been on the cards for a while, to still recognize gun ownership, but to particularly and specifically single out self-defense as something that you can no longer apply for a license for, it's ridiculous. That they would say, yes, we are fine with gun ownership, we're fine with sport shooting and hunting, and all of that is great. Please go ahead. But if you want to defend yourself, that's going to be a big problem. That is arbitrary. It's certainly irrational. And again, it comes back to government not having any kind of mandate to engage in that conduct. And a lot of people say that it's possible to disarm a society and to not have oppression. Look at Japan, look at certain European countries. But you need to bear in mind that South African society is not like those. We are a very low social trust society. As a general rule, we do not like each other, unfortunately. We're friendly, but we do have some kind of tension between South Africans. Lots of poverty, lots of political opportunism, political instability even. We are not the type of society that can get away with total disarmament and have the prosperous Norwegian utopia that many authoritarians look at as ideal. It's not going to work here. It's not going to happen here. The levels of crime in our country absolutely justify a less is more approach to gun control, and I'm firmly with Gideon on that point, that we can have very simple, common sense, efficient gun control, but which doesn't get into any kind of arbitrary limits on the ammunition that you may have, or whether your safe is bolted to the floor of your house and stuff like that. That's all possible, and I think that's something that South Africans would welcome readily. Not referring to the intellectual elites, because for some reason there's just a very hardline anti-gun mentality there. But I think ordinary South Africans will be very keen on that, and it will be far more in line with the vision that our constitution has adopted for our society.
Yeah, and I mean, just like the condescending nature of these quote-unquote liberal elites living in their fenced-off estates, you know, in the east of Pretoria or the northern suburbs of Joburg, who are vehemently anti-gun, yet they have armed guards literally patrolling their houses constantly, protecting them, but they do not want to afford the ability to be protected by a gun to people who might not be able to afford paying armed guards or living in a security estate, etc. I mean, I live in a complex where we have guards, but they are definitely not armed. So not everyone can afford it. And I think that's a very, very, you know, I think this is a legitimate instance of being able to say, you know, check your privilege. If you are against people being able to own firearms to defend themselves, I think you do need to check your privilege that you hold in society. But on the broader issues facing us now, I think people are nobody thinks about the possible implications that this whole COVID-19 authoritarian communist rubbish what it holds for gun rights in South Africa. I mean, specifically with respect to Police Minister Bekisele. I mean, he's gone on an absolute power trip. I mean, even the UN, its Secretary General, came out and said South Africa is one of the 5 countries, if I'm not mistaken, around the world where the abuses of power, specifically by the security forces, are really, really problematic. Now, take this power trip, and if Bekisele continues on this power trip and is not held accountable, what that could imply for gun owners. I don't know about you, Gideon. How do you see the future play out in South Africa with respect to gun rights and gun ownership?
So Bekisele has been hardline anti-civilian gun ownership from the start. He has not actually even tried hiding that. So he came out of the starting blocks when he took over as Minister of Police about 2 or so years ago, about 2 years ago, and that's what he's maintained, his narrative, like constantly. What he forgets is there's quite a few angles to this. One is the color of gun ownership, civilian gun ownership in South Africa isn't predominantly white and Asmund for an extensive period of time. It is black, and it makes sense. It's a numbers game. It is the majority population. We were a firearm deprived society prior to 1994. After 1994, if you're a black South African or a colored South African, you could license guns now pretty much for the first time without arbitrary restrictions. And it happened between 1994 and 1999. About nearly 1.2 million new firearm licenses were granted, and most of these licenses went to what we now refer to as previously disadvantaged individuals. And at the same time, sustained and historic decline in our homicide rate happened. Now, a scientist will tell you you cannot prove a hypothesis. You can only disprove a false hypothesis. And if your hypothesis is an increase in civilian firearm ownership leads to more murder, well, you can see where the two graphs cross each other as civilian gun ownership increases markedly after 1994. And that homicide rate just kept dropping and kept dropping and kept dropping. And I think it kept dropping to about 2004 or 2005. And it maintained that sustained decline for more than a decade until the Firearms Control Act, funnily enough, became law in June or July 2004, when it increased for the first time since like 1992. So firstly, civilian gun ownership doesn't lead to more murder and death. The second point is civilians are far more responsible firearm owners than the state is, because a brief perusal that Vikas Erasmus and myself did a few years ago to try, and there was a claim that came to us from a politician that said he has it on good authority that the police lose about 7 times per capita more guns than civilians do. Is any truth to this? So we went and we investigated by use of what was in the public domain, and we found that it's roughly between 4.5 to 13 times more that they lose, which is a very wide variance. But it makes it pretty safe to conclude that 7 times more is not an unrealistic figure. So we're better custodians of firearms in the state. We kill far fewer people than the government does. And this lockdown, I'm actually kind of to a degree glad it happened, not because of the economic devastation, not because of our rights being trampled, but for the first time, I think the general public has been exposed to the type of authoritarian, incompetent aggression that is forthcoming from government and state officials like Bekitsele, that gun owners have been struggling with for years. Now the general public got a taste of it. And I don't think, at least I hope, they didn't like it.
Yeah, and just quickly on the issue of the relationship between gun ownership and gun violence, homicides. A while back, I basically took a lot of data from well over 150 countries around the world and plotted their gun ownership rates per 100,000 people with their gun homicide rates per 100,000 people. And there is a very, very weak correlation that you see between those two things. But when you do actually plot what's called a regression line on the scatter plot to see what the relationship is, actually see that if you were to argue that no, there is some sort of correlation, it would actually be negative. I mean, the data is so spurious on the issue of gun ownership and gun homicide rates. And I mean, I've always said this, if you give 1 million guns to 1 million good people, you're not going to see problems. If you give 1 million guns to 1 million bad people, you are going to see them slaughter each other. So it comes down to the culture in society and the respect for the value of human life. And I think that is a systemic problem in South Africa, is that there's no respect for individual bodily autonomy in general. Extremely high murder rates, extremely high rape rates, etc. And I think that is, we need to delve into these systemic issues in South African society, and we need to address those issues specifically and not just treat what we perceive as a symptom and just, which is basically just window dressing that just in effect makes everything worse. But I see we might run out of time soon, so I'm just going to ask for some last thoughts from your side, James. Martin, starting with you. Any last thoughts on this issue?
Sure. I think 2 points that should always be made that will seem obvious to us, but I think a lot of people may just hear for the first time. The first one is that criminals do not obey the law. It's what being criminal means. So controlling the supply and so on of legal firearms in your country is not going to dissuade any murderer, rapist, robber any more than an incompetent police force. They will find the firearms, and it's been very clearly noted how ineffective our borders are, which I'm not totally opposed to, but guns will stream across those borders, and you can apply the Firearms Control Act as hard as you want. Criminals will get guns in this country, and if you take guns away completely, there will be stabbing epidemics, and as happened I think in Australia and in Britain, criminals just stab people. I mean, they will adapt. They do not care. You can't make murder illegal and expect people and murderers to be like, wow, geez, now it's illegal, we won't do it anymore. It doesn't work. It simply does not work. And it only negatively affects people who care about the law. So whenever you make gun control more stringent, it is law-abiding citizens who are going to be detrimentally affected by that. because they will be the ones fully intending to abide by the law and not be violent, who are going to have to adhere to those regulations, whereas criminals simply won't, and they will get their guns regardless. And then the second point is that every instance of oppression in recent human history has been preceded by wide-scale disarmament of the civilian population. That has happened in South Africa since the Union of South Africa was created, and even before that, the sale of any type of weaponry was totally prohibited to blacks and non-whites in this country. We've made this point before, but imagine how far more difficult it would have been to apply apartheid if the majority of the black population was armed. And everyone knows the same thing happened in Cambodia, the same thing happened in China, the same thing happened in Nazi Germany. The Jews were very famously disarmed before the Holocaust began. So that's not me saying that there's a genocide or wide-scale oppression in South Africa's future, but it does come to the point of it's a constitutionalist point, basically. It's a check and a balance on the exercise of government power. It's not a rebellion. It's simply something that civil society, that the citizenry should have at its disposal if government decides to start acting unlawfully and start treading on their rights. These instances of the police killing people for by all accounts doing what they're allowed to do in terms of the lockdown regulations, like buying essential goods, getting killed for that, a civilian would be justified in defending themselves against the police with a firearm according to our law right now, because that is unlawful action by the security forces. So there is no recommendation of the Boogaloo or rebellion or civil uprising, none of that. But firearms are crucial to ensuring that government stays within the four corners of the law and ensuring that no grand re-engineerings of society, as the grand builders Hitler and Mao and their ilk thought it was, can occur. As they say, an armed society is a polite society, and that's something that I very firmly believe in.
Yeah, no, definitely agree with you, especially on that last point. Gideon, last thoughts from your side?
Also, just two. One is political, one is practical. From a political point of view, the first person to stand up against civilian disarmament that is recorded in the South African history was a black man named John Tengu Jabavu, and he did it in his protestation against the Peace Preservation Act of 1878, or was it 1876? Doesn't matter. Martin will, you can Google it. And he was 19 years old at the time, and he wrote a series of letters to the Argus protesting against this colonial law that had the sole purpose, it was florally worded, obviously, at the time, as these things are to this day, in order to motivate disarming black natives to make the settler community feel more secure. So it's about security theatre again, feeling safe. And this led to two conflicts in South African history, the conflicts about civilian disarmament. And the first one was the persecution of the Amashlubi chief, Langalibalele Bashlele, in the late 1870s, where he was forcibly disarmed, or rather his tribe were forcibly disarmed, and he said, not a chance, we will fight this. And they did. And he ended up incarcerated in Robben Island until he was released. And Sir Oliver Reginald Pierce referred to the whole thing as a disgrace to British justice at the time. And the second conflict was the Basotho Gun War, which went a little bit better. That was 1880, 1881, where the Cape Colony sent an expeditionary force to forcibly disarm the Basotho. They got their asses kicked horrendously by the Basotho, and they got to keep their guns. So we fought two wars in this country already against civilian disarmament, physical bloody wars. That's the political side. The practical side, you are always the first responder to your personal crime scene. You're the first person there. If you've got the tools and the talent and the mindset to respond correctly, that could mean the difference between life and death. But if you don't have the correct tools, whether it's access to a firearm or whatever, your chances diminish quite dramatically in surviving the encounter. And I think that's something that ordinary people just need to bear in mind.
Yeah, I think that's a good note to end the session on. You are always the first responder to your crime scene. Thank you, viewers and listeners, for sticking with us. This was a bit of a long podcast, but definitely worth it. Hopefully, in future, we can broach this topic again. Hopefully, the South African government lets go of the power trip that it's on at the moment. Let's go of the authoritarian tendencies, not just with respect to gun rights, but with respect to civil liberties in general. Remember, you can find us on Facebook at Free Market Foundation South Africa, as well as on Twitter. You can also find Gideon's page, paratus.info, on Facebook. I really urge you to go follow that, as well as go and support civil liberty societies such as Gun Owners South Africa. But yeah, I think that's it for today. Thank you for sticking with us, and see you soon.